I knew the HOA was bad, but I never expected them to outright steal my land. It started when I got a letter in the mail, an official notice from the HOA, claiming they had expanded the community office, and that my backyard was now considered common property. I nearly choked on my coffee. My backyard? Common property. I stormed outside, and sure enough, there it was, a brand new HOA office, built right on my land. The nerve of these people. I marched over to the building, my fists clenched. Inside, sitting at a shiny new desk like she was some kind of royalty, was Abigail Prescott, the HOA president. She was a middle-aged woman with an ironed blouse that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle in its life. Her sharp eyes flicked up at me, and she gave a tight, forced smile. "Travis," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "I was wondering when you'd come by. You built this on my property," I said, pointing at the walls around us. "Without asking. Without my permission." Abigail clasped her hands together like she was about to deliver some wise lecture. "You see, Travis, after reviewing the HOA guidelines, we determined that your land was underutilized and better suited for community purposes." I stared at her, absolutely dumbfounded. "Underutilized? It's my backyard." She waved a hand dismissively. "Well, now it's benefiting everyone. Besides, it's already done. Moving the structure now would be inconvenient." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. "So you just took it?" Abigail leaned forward. "Travis, you should be honored. The HOA office will increase property values for everyone. And we'll be happy to let you use the facilities for a small membership fee, of course." I let out a sharp laugh. "You stole my land and now want me to pay to use it?" She raised an eyebrow. "It's not stealing, it's reallocating for the good of the neighborhood." I clenched my jaw. I could sue. I could go to the city. But I had a better idea. If Abigail thought she could take my land and do whatever she wanted with it, she was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. I walked out of that office with my blood boiling, but I wasn't about to let Abigail or the HOA get away with this. She had made one critical mistake. She assumed I would just roll over and accept it. What she didn't know was that I had been raised by a father who worked in property law for over 30 years. I knew my rights. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering every document I had on my property survey maps. The deed, zoning regulations. My land was clearly marked, and there was no legal loophole she could use to claim it. The HOA had no jurisdiction over private property without the owner's consent, and they certainly couldn't just seize it because they thought it was underutilized. But I wasn't just going to fight this in court. Abigail had played dirty, and I intended to make her regret it in a way she would never forget. The next morning, I made some calls. My old friend Doug, a livestock supplier, picked up after 2 rings. "Travis, haven't heard from you in a while. What's up?" "Doug, I need some pigs. Real dirty, real loud ones. Think you can help me out?" There was a pause, then he burst into laughter. "Oh, this has gotta be good. How many we talking?" "Enough to fill a building." A few hours later, Doug arrived with a trailer full of pigs. These were not the cute, farm-friendly kind you'd see in a children's book. These were big, stubborn, and smelled like the inside of a sewer pipe. Perfect. We herded them into the so-called HOA office, making sure they had plenty of food and water. Within minutes, the place reeked of pig manure. The sound of grunting and squealing echoed from inside, and I had to fight the urge to grin. By the time Abigail arrived, the stench was unbearable. She wore a pristine white blouse and beige slacks, which was a mistake. The second she stepped too close, one of the pigs snorted loudly and kicked up a spray of mud or worse all over her shoes. She recoiled in horror, gagging. "What is the meaning of this?" I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Oh, this? Just making use of my property. This is an HOA office, not a barnyard," she shrieked, waving a hand in front of her nose. I pulled out my property deed and held it up. "Actually, this is my land. And since the HOA didn't bother getting my permission before building here, I figured I'd use my space however I wanted." Her face twisted in fury. "You can't do this." "Sure I can," I said casually. "You built on private property without legal authorization. That means this building is mine, and I've decided to turn it into pig housing. Unless you'd like to explain to the city why you constructed an illegal structure." Her mouth opened and closed as she struggled to find a response. "Or," I continued, "you can remove the building at HOA expense and return my land to how it was before. Your choice." Her face was turning red, but she knew she was caught. If she pushed this further, the entire HOA could be in serious legal trouble. "This isn't over," she spat. I gestured to the pigs. "Better hurry. They're getting comfortable." She stormed off, heels squelching in the mud. By the end of the week, the HOA had no choice but to tear down the office and restore my yard. Abigail avoided me after that, but the rest of the neighborhood had a new favorite story. Justice never smelled so sweet. The day after the HOA tore down their illegally built office, I stepped into my backyard and took a deep breath of fresh, pig-free air. The land was mine again. The sight of the flattened ground where the building used to stand brought a deep sense of satisfaction. But I knew Abigail Prescott wasn't the type to let something like this go. I wasn't wrong. Late that evening, a letter slid under my door. I picked it up and unfolded it. As expected, it was from the HOA. Abigail's name was stamped at the bottom in her signature overconfident scrawl. The letter demanded I pay restitution fees for the damage caused by my livestock to the now demolished office. I let out a short laugh. Damage? To a building that had no legal right to exist in the first place? The audacity would have been impressive if it wasn't so pathetic. I grabbed my phone and dialed a number I knew well. My father picked up after 2 rings. I explained the situation, and by the time I finished, I could hear him shaking his head through the phone. "They're trying to intimidate you. Legally, they don't have a leg to stand on. That structure was built without permits and they destroyed it themselves. They can't fine you for land they had no right to occupy." I already knew that, but it was always good to get confirmation. "So what's my next move?" "Send them a formal cease and desist letter. If they keep harassing you, we escalate. And Travis, start documenting everything. They're desperate now, which means they'll get reckless." The next morning, I drafted the letter in hand, delivered it straight to the HOA office, the real one, not the illegal structure they had been forced to remove. When I arrived, Abigail was in the middle of a meeting with a few board members. I didn't wait to be acknowledged. I walked up to the table, placed the letter in front of her, and took a step back. She pursed her lips as she unfolded the document, her eyes scanning the words. After a few seconds, she set it down and looked up at me with forced politeness. "Travis, you seem to have misunderstood the intent of our notice." "I understood it just fine." I crossed my arms. "You tried to fine me for damage to a structure that shouldn't have existed. This letter makes it clear that I won't tolerate any more harassment." One of the board members, a man named Richard, cleared his throat. "We're simply ensuring fairness, Travis. The office was built on private land without permission," I interrupted. "The HOA has no authority over my property. If you keep pushing, we're taking this to court." Abigail's expression remained unreadable, but I could see the tension in her jaw. "There's no need for threats. Then stop giving me reasons to make them." I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving the letter sitting on the table like a loaded gun. For a few days, things were quiet. No new letters. No sudden fines, no passive-aggressive notices about my lack of community cooperation. I almost thought, briefly, that Abigail had learned her lesson. Then I woke up to find my backyard fence missing. I stood at the edge of my property, staring at the bare ground where my fence had been the day before. The posts had been yanked clean out, the wooden panels stacked neatly to the side as if someone thought they were doing me a favor. I glanced toward the street and wasn't surprised to see Abigail standing there with her clipboard, speaking to a group of HOA board members. I took a slow breath and approached, my boots crunching against the gravel of my driveway. Abigail noticed me and offered a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, Travis. I see you've noticed the improvements." "Improvements?" I gestured toward my now exposed backyard. "You tore down my fence." She tilted her head slightly, feigning innocence. "Your fence was in violation of the HOA's updated aesthetic guidelines. We sent out a notice last week." I narrowed my eyes. I didn't receive any notice. "Oh dear. It must have gotten lost in the mail." She made a note on her clipboard. Regardless, the board voted to remove non-compliant fencing to ensure uniformity throughout the neighborhood. I clenched my jaw. Uniformity? She nodded, her expression smug. It's important for property values, Travis. Your fencing was outdated and didn't match the approved design. I exhaled slowly. Let me get this straight. You tore down my fence without permission on my private property, and now you expect me to install a new one that meets your guidelines. Abigail gave a small shrug. If you'd like to remain in compliance, yes. I stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward my house. Abigail probably thought she'd won, that I was retreating in defeat. She had no idea what was coming next. That night, I made another call. By the following afternoon, a truck pulled up in front of my house, loaded with brand-new fencing 10-foot-tall, industrial-grade steel panels. As the workers began installing the new fence, Abigail arrived, her expression shifting from smug to furious the moment she saw what I was doing. She stormed up to me. "This is unacceptable." I leaned against my porch railing. "Why?" The HOA said my fence was non-compliant. "I'm fixing that." She gestured wildly at the towering steel panels. "This is a security fence. It looks like a prison wall." I nodded. "It's within my property rights. No HOA rules prohibit steel fencing." Her face turned an alarming shade of red. "This is not in the spirit of community aesthetics." I shrugged. Neither was stealing my backyard. The moment the last panel was in place, she stomped off, muttering under her breath. Now, my property was secure. They couldn't take my land, they couldn't tear down my fence again, and Abigail Prescott had just learned a painful lesson: when you push someone too far, they push back harder. The new steel fence stood tall, casting long shadows across my yard as the evening sun dipped behind it. The HOA had pushed me too far, and now they were learning that I wasn't the kind of homeowner they could bully into submission. Abigail had made that mistake once with the illegal office. Now she was realizing that every move she made against me only backfired spectacularly. I had expected retaliation, but even I had underestimated Abigail's level of pettiness. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab my mail and immediately noticed something off. A bright orange notice was taped to my mailbox. The bold letters at the top read, "Code violation, fines pending." My jaw tightened as I pulled it off and read the so-called infraction. Unauthorized commercial activity conducted on residential property. I let out a dry chuckle. So this was her next move. She was trying to frame the pig stunt as me running a business. It was laughable, but I wasn't about to ignore it. I glanced down the street and, sure enough, there she was. Abigail stood by the HOA office, clipboard in hand, watching me like a hawk. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I walked back inside, grabbed my phone, and dialed a number. By the afternoon, I was sitting in the office of a local zoning commissioner, a man named Dennis who had been dealing with HOA complaints for over a decade. He skimmed through the violation notice, shaking his head. "This is nonsense," he said. "They're trying to weaponize zoning laws against you, but they don't have the authority to enforce city codes. That's a municipal issue, not an HOA one." "Then why bother?" I asked. Dennis leaned back in his chair. "They're hoping you believe they can fine you into submission. If you pay up, they'll take that as an admission of guilt and keep coming after you." I nodded. "So what's my best move?" He pulled out a stamp and slammed it onto the violation notice. "Null and void. If they try this again, send them my way." I took the stamped notice and left with a grin. This was going to be fun. The next morning, I walked straight to the HOA office and found Abigail inside, sipping some overpriced bottled water like she was royalty. She barely looked up as I placed the stamped notice on her desk. "Nice try," I said. She picked it up, her eyes narrowing as she read the red void stamp across the paper. "This doesn't change the fact that you violated community standards," she said, setting the paper down with a forced calmness. "You don't enforce city zoning laws," I said. "The commissioner made that clear." She tapped her nails against the desk. "You can't just do whatever you want in this neighborhood, Travis." "Neither can you," I said. "And unlike you, I actually checked the law before making a move." Her nostrils flared slightly, but she quickly masked her frustration behind a tight-lipped expression. "This isn't over," she said. I grinned. "You keep saying that, but you keep losing." As I walked out, I knew she was already planning her next move. The problem was, she was running out of options. A few days passed, and I enjoyed the silence. No new fines, no new violations, just the occasional glare from Abigail whenever we crossed paths. But I wasn't naive. I knew she was plotting something. Then, one evening, I heard the sound of metal scraping against concrete. I stepped outside and saw a tow truck parked in front of my house, its winch hooked onto my truck. A man in a reflective vest stood beside it, clipboard in hand. "What's going on here?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Vehicle violation," the tow operator said. HOA reported this truck as an unauthorized commercial vehicle parked on residential property. I exhaled through my nose. "It's my personal vehicle," he shrugged. "I just follow the orders I'm given." I turned and sure enough, Abigail was standing at the end of the street, watching with her arms crossed. I walked up to the tow truck driver and pulled out my phone. "You got a removal request in writing?" He hesitated. "That was a no. You know, if you tow a vehicle without a legal order, that's theft, right?" I said. "And if you so much as move this truck an inch, I'll have you arrested for it." The driver shifted uncomfortably. "I was just told." "Yeah, by someone who doesn't have the authority to tow private property," I cut in. "Now unhook it." He glanced toward Abigail, who gave a sharp shake of her head. I sighed and dialed a number. "Non-emergency police line, what's your situation?" The tow operator paled. All right, I'm unhooking it." I didn't hang up until I watched him retract the winch and drive off. Abigail's face was tight with frustration as I turned toward her. "That was pathetic," I said. She lifted her chin. "We have rules, Travis. You're not above them." "Neither are you," I said. "And you just tried to commit vehicle theft under the guise of enforcement. That's illegal." She scoffed. "You can't prove anything." I held up my phone. Dash cam. Recorded everything. For the first time, a flicker of panic crossed her face. "Now," I continued, "you and your little board have two choices. You can either stop this nonsense, or I can take this footage to an attorney and file a lawsuit against you personally, not just the HOA. Your call." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. I watched her retreat, knowing that this was the beginning of the end for her reign over the neighborhood. She had pushed too far, and now she was the one on the defensive. I wasn't just winning. I was dismantling her entire game piece by piece. The next few days were eerily quiet. No passive-aggressive letters, no sudden rule changes, and most importantly, no more blatant attempts at taking my property. Abigail Prescott had finally realized that every move she made against me ended in disaster for her. The HOA had lost every battle so far, and I could feel the shift in power. But I knew Abigail, and I knew she wasn't the type to accept defeat. She just needed time to regroup, to find another way to exert control. I wasn't about to wait for that to happen. I was going on the offensive. I spent the morning going through public records. Everything the HOA had ever filed with the city, every financial statement that was legally accessible, every zoning request they had submitted. I wanted to know exactly how deep their corruption went, and I wasn't surprised when I started finding inconsistencies. The HOA had been collecting dues for years under the guise of community improvements, but there were no records of those funds being used for actual maintenance. No landscaping contracts, no verified repairs, no evidence the money was going where it was supposed to. What I did find, however, was a series of suspicious transactions tied directly to Abigail. A sizable portion of the HOA's funds had been funneled into an account under the name of a shell company. That account was linked to a property Abigail had purchased last year. She had been using HOA money to finance her own personal investments. There it was, the leverage I needed. That evening, I gathered my evidence and made my way to the community center where the monthly HOA meeting was in full swing. The room was packed with residents, most of whom had no idea what really went on behind the scenes. Abigail sat at the front, her usual air of superiority on full display as she addressed the homeowners with that same fake warmth she always used when she wanted to manipulate people. I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked straight to the front of the room and placed a thick stack of documents on the table. The room quieted as people turned to look at me. Abigail's expression barely shifted, but I saw the way her fingers tensed around the edges of her clipboard. I spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. I've spent the last few days looking into the HOA's financial records, specifically where our dues have been going. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Abigail interjected with a forced chuckle. "Travis, this meeting is for community discussions, not personal grievances." I ignored her. The HOA has been collecting thousands of dollars in dues every year, supposedly for neighborhood improvements. But there's no record of that money being spent on anything other than administrative costs. People started shifting in their seats. A man near the back frowned. What do you mean no record? I mean, the HOA hasn't paid for a single documented repair in over 3 years. No landscaping, no road maintenance, nothing. But you know what has been paid for? A private property purchased under a shell company linked directly to Abigail. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Abigail's face finally cracked. That's a ridiculous accusation, she snapped. You don't have the authority to audit HOA finances. I pulled out a printed bank statement and held it up. This says otherwise. The transactions are right here, Abigail. You've been using HOA funds to buy real estate for yourself while telling the rest of us the money is going toward the community. The room exploded into chatter. Several residents stood, demanding answers. Abigail's usual composure was slipping. You have no idea what you're talking about, she spat. This is a misunderstanding. I leaned on the table. Then explain it. Explain why HOA money is sitting in a private account linked to you. Explain why the roads haven't been repaved in 5 years while you've been funneling funds into your property investments. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The silence stretched. A woman near the front stood. I've been paying HOA dues for over a decade. If what he's saying is true, I want answers. Now. More voices joined in. Where's the money, Abigail? You've been stealing from us? Abigail's eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but her board members were frozen, unwilling to step in. She had lost control of the meeting. I wasn't done. I've already forwarded the financial discrepancies to the city. If you think this is just going to go away, you're wrong. There's going to be an official investigation. That did it. Panic flickered across her face. She turned to her board members, but they were already distancing themselves, avoiding her gaze. Richard, one of the senior board members, cleared his throat. If there's financial misconduct, we need to address it immediately. This is serious. Abigail shot him a glare, but the damage was done. The room was turning against her. I stepped back, letting the chaos unfold. Abigail had spent years controlling this neighborhood, manipulating homeowners, and weaponizing the HOA to serve her own interests. But now her reign was crumbling. She stood abruptly, gathering her papers. This meeting is adjourned, she announced, her voice shaking slightly. No one listened. People were still talking, demanding explanations, questioning everything they had been told. As Abigail stormed out of the room, I watched her go, knowing full well this was only the beginning of her downfall. The HOA wasn't just going to lose this fight. It was about to collapse under the weight of its own corruption. And I was more than happy to watch it burn. Abigail Prescott had fled the HOA meeting like a cornered animal, but the damage was already done. The entire neighborhood had seen the evidence of her corruption, and the city was now involved. There was no coming back from this. The following morning, I stood on my porch, sipping a fresh cup of coffee, watching as the HOA board members trickled into the community office. Every single one of them had been silent during Abigail's downfall, and now they were scrambling to figure out their next move. I wasn't worried. I had already ensured there was no move left for them to make. By noon, an official-looking car pulled up in front of the HOA office. A city investigator stepped out, adjusting his tie as he approached the building. I recognized him, Mark Holloway, the man Dennis from zoning had mentioned when I forwarded the financial discrepancies. I leaned against my porch railing, enjoying the show as Mark disappeared inside. It didn't take long. Less than an hour later, Abigail stormed out of the office, her face pale and tight with barely contained fury. She marched past the other board members without a word, got into her car, and sped off. One by one, the remaining members exited, some shaking their heads, others looking downright ill. The last to leave was Richard, the senior board member who had distanced himself from Abigail during the meeting. Instead of heading to his car, he walked straight toward my house. I waited, letting him come to me. He stopped at the base of my porch steps, rubbing the back of his neck. You made your point, Travis. I raised an eyebrow. Did I? He sighed. The city's launching a full investigation. The HOA's finances are frozen until further notice, and Abigail's officially stepped down as president. That was fast. Stepped down or forced out? Richard hesitated. Let's just say she didn't have a choice. I took another sip of coffee. So what happens now? We're dissolving the HOA. His voice was flat, resigned. Once the investigation wraps up, the community will vote on whether to disband entirely. But after everything that's come to light, I think we both know how that's going to go. I nodded. Abigail's corruption had tainted the entire organization. There was no salvaging it. Richard hesitated again, then cleared his throat. Look, I know you and Abigail had your differences. I laughed. That's one way to put it. He exhaled through his nose. Point is, she overplayed her hand, and she lost. But not everyone on the board was in on her schemes. Some of us just wanted to keep the neighborhood running smoothly. I tilted my head. Then why didn't you speak up sooner? He didn't have an answer for that. After a long moment, he shook his head. It doesn't matter now. The HOA's done for. Just figured you deserved to hear it from someone on the inside. I studied him for a second, then nodded. Appreciate the update. Richard gave a small nod in return before heading back to his car. As he drove off, I let out a slow breath, taking in the quiet street. It was over. No more surprise fines. No more stolen property. No more HOA trying to dictate how I lived on my own land. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was free. That evening, I grabbed a few beers and sat out in my backyard, fully restored to what it had been before Abigail tried to steal it. The air was crisp, the sky painted in hues of orange and deep purple as the sun set. I heard footsteps approaching and glanced up to see Doug strolling over, hands in his pockets. He nodded toward the empty space where the illegal HOA office had once stood. Gotta say, I never expected this whole mess to end with you bringing down an entire homeowners association. I chuckled. Neither did they. Doug sat down on one of the lawn chairs, cracking open a beer. So what's next? You gonna run for mayor or something? I snorted. I think I've had enough politics for one lifetime. He grinned, taking a sip. Well, if you ever need a side hustle, I hear pig housing is a lucrative business. We both laughed, the sound carrying through the open space that was once unlawfully taken from me. The neighborhood was already changing. Without Abigail's iron grip, people were starting to come together on their own terms without fear of fines or ridiculous restrictions. And as I sat there, enjoying the peace of a battle well fought, I knew one thing for certain. Abigail Prescott had tried to control this neighborhood, but in the end she had lost everything.